All right, welcome everyone. We're very excited for the opportunity to share a little bit about relational forest therapy. My name is Manuela Siegfried. I'm the training director for the Association of Nature and Forest Therapy. And here with me is Amos Clifford, the founder of the Association of Nature and Forest Therapy. So we're going to try to share leanly a little bit about relational forest therapy, what it is, and how it all started. So, Amos, I know when you started ANFT over 10 years ago, the relational aspect was a central part of your motivation for doing this. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I would say it was at the very heart of why I got involved in this work. I had been for many years involved in a nature connection in a lot of ways. And at the time when I was starting to dream into what became ANFT, I'd been working in restorative justice. And that's a model where when a crime has been committed or someone's harmed another person, you bring them together in dialogue. And by being in dialogue, you can come into a better understanding of what took place and what the impacts of that were. And very importantly, what can be done to make things right or as right as possible. So I was doing that work and it was interesting. But I kept thinking about how, just by the nature of the culture and the times we live in, human beings live in relationship with nature, with the more than human world, where we are constantly harming it. So I had the question, how can we have dialogues with the other than human beings, with the landscapes themselves? How can we enter into the kind of relationship where we can hear their voices and what are they asking for now? And that was really at the heart of my inquiry. At the time, I started looking for a way to bring people into relationship with nature.
Right. Yeah. And it's this kind of way of being that we have been using nature basically, like we have been seeing nature as a mere resource for many years. And personally, I think that's at the very core of some of the major problems we're having, where it's like, well, nature cannot just be used. You cannot just see nature as a resource. And I think that also kind of permeated into the forest therapy aspect, where a lot of people are talking about all the benefits that humans can get from nature. And it's not that we are not in agreement with that. Of course, that's true. But going a step further and saying, like, well, this is again kind of an extractive way of seeing nature, where you're like seeing nature as a resource for your well-being,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
do you want to talk a little bit about how we bring in the relational aspect when we do forest therapy walks?
Well, the first big stretch to make here to really be in relationship is to be open to the idea that other than human beings have their own kind of sentience. And so, because they have their own kind of sentience, there are actually possibilities of modes of communication between us. So, I can communicate with a tree, or I can communicate with a stream, or I can communicate with a flower or a stone. And in that communication, we can come into a kind of relationship where the voices of the trees and the stones and the rivers start coming into my consciousness and my awareness. And so many of the ways in which we've designed the ANFT, what we call the standard sequence, and the variety of invitations we use are specifically intended to open up the possibility of some kind of communication happening. So, an obvious example is when we invite someone to have a conversation with a tree. And for many people, this sounds like crazy. What do you mean, conversation with a tree? but almost everyone who takes up this invitation comes away with something of value. And often we'll hear people say, the tree said to me. Now, I know when they're saying that, they didn't probably hear words in their ears, spoken words, but in their body, in their way of knowing, something came to them that they felt was from the tree and that was of some value, some interest to them. That's a relational event.
Yeah, and I think it's important also to kind of maybe expand a little bit on communication, because then oftentimes people are a little bit blocked by thinking, well, what does that mean to be sentient, right? And sentience is basically just the ability to perceive, but that doesn't mean that everyone or every being, the trees or other beings out in nature, are going to perceive the same way we perceive. So there are many ways of perception, right? Many different ways of perception, way beyond our five basic senses. So the trees have many senses that we don't have, but they can perceive different things. So I know for myself, oftentimes people have a really hard time thinking of, for example, a stone as a sentient being, right? Or a stream. Trees somehow, yeah, most people still kind of can imagine that trees can communicate, but then when you go a step further, and like you said, it's not that we're trying to convince people, it's just opening up that possibility, maybe expanding their perspective just a little bit to consider that this might be a different story. And the relational aspect is really about going beyond of thinking only about the benefits we can get, but also really thinking about what benefits can we offer the modern human world or nature beyond the fact that we need nature to survive, because then it becomes again about us, right? It's like, oh, we need to take care of nature because we need nature to survive. Well, what about taking care of nature just because we love nature, right? So
Yeah. Well, you brought up an interesting point there about sentience and what that might mean. And you used the example of a stone. I have a stone here that I keep on my desk. This stone came back with me from Lithuania. That's where I first developed a relationship with this stone. And part of what happens is if I hold this stone against my heart, right in my heart region, I start experiencing the stone and myself and the world around me in a subtly different way. And that is what we might consider a kind of a field of sentience that I become aware of. So we think of our sentience as living up here inside our brains. The sentience that we call on for connecting with the other than human beings lives primarily in our hearts. And so it requires us to learn how to listen to our hearts, how to cultivate our awareness of the field that our heart creates and how it's receiving impressions, which you could think of as a way of receiving communications from the world around us. And as we do that, we enter into a kind of sentience that goes beyond the boundaries of our mind. So an example is if you think of the brain as being composed of many different neurons. Now think of the forest, each tree has its own sentience, but when you have a big collection of them, they are all connecting. Their sentience is connecting in some way. And so the forest itself has a sentience that is the collected effect of all the different trees and other beings that are in the forest. Now, when I walk into the forest with my own awareness through the relational forest therapy methods, I sometimes feel like what's happened is I've entered into and become a part of the mind of the forest. So my field of awareness is significantly different than it is, normal everyday life.
I really like what you brought up, because what's coming up for me is that this is also kind of that remembering of our belonging into the natural world, and somehow that opening up of that communication and that heart space also supports us to kind of close that illusion of separation that we live in, where it's like we're here, nature's out there. In reality, we're all part of it, right? So I feel like when we remember our innate capacity to communicate beyond words through our heart, we
Yeah.
also come back to that sense of belonging into this world. So yeah.
Yeah, I think remembering it is more process of remembering than necessarily learning something new. And I think of, for example, when I designed the training method we use called Web of Interbeing, the intention of that was to, by remembering the different connections we have with the various beings around us, we strengthen our relationships with them, but also our own sense of belonging in the world.
Totally. And I know, Amos, you and I, we could go on and on and on talking about this topic.
Yes, we could. We could, and if you
And
don't stop us, we will. Uh-huh.
yeah, and maybe we can just leave it here. And yeah, really looking forward and exploring ways of bringing maybe some collaboration to Italy, and hopefully able to offer some sort of workshop about relational forest therapy. That would be really amazing. So thank you so much for your time.
I would love to come to Italy and meet our colleagues there and explore these ideas together. And in the meantime, if any of you who are watching this video uh, have questions, maybe you can write them down and send them to Manuela, and we'll dive into those.
Perfect.
Yeah, thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you, everyone.